You're listening to the Better for America podcast, presented by Amac, the Association of Mature American Citizens.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rebecca Weber, and this is your Amac podcast, Better for America. The reason why we do this podcast is to share information and to help get the truth in front of as many Americans as possible. Now, today, more than ever, many people are confused about what they're hearing and reading in the news. For example, parents are confused about whether or not to support critical race theory. So folks need to know what it actually is. And that is what I will attempt to explain here to you today. Common Core advocates, including some who label themselves as conservatives even, are teaming up with critical race theory and action civic advocates to push national history and civic standards for the first time. They're calling this the Civics Secures Democracy Act. And it's not patriotic history and civics, it's radical left history and civics. And that is what we all need to understand. Now, this bill would appropriate $1 billion in federal money to support K through 12 curriculum development, teacher training, and research on the teaching of history and civics. How this $1 billion is actually spent requires a very close reading of the legislative language. So let me explain a little bit more. On the action civics front, grants are awarded to programs based on evidence-based practices, which means activities that include projects, experimental learning, and service learning, all of which are terms that have been used to describe curriculums in which students are able to earn course credit for engaging in leftist protests and lobbying. It also includes programs that encourage media literacy. Media literacy education directs students to media sources that articulate the Democrat position and discourages the use of those sources that they deem as fake news. On the critical race theory front, this bill requires the Department of Education to prioritize programs that, one, improve knowledge and engagement among students traditionally underserved, two, close the gaps in civic knowledge and achievement among students of different income levels, racial and ethnic groups, and even native languages, and three, integrate evidence-based practices, the same term that we just previously heard as a use to cover for action civics. So this sounds innocuous, not very harmful, but it is. The concept of equity at the core of modern left-wing ideology is also at the heart of this bill. And that's important. The concept of equity is at the heart of this bill. So how exactly does the left use race, racism, and equity to divide Americans? Well, if you go to our website, you can find an article entitled A Woke Dictionary, a guide to how the left uses racist, racism, and equity to divide Americans. And this article was written by Joshua Charles, one of my favorite Amac writers. And when I first read this article, I thought, well, this might be sort of funny. And sadly, it's very true. It's very true. We're going to understand here what the left means when they use the word racist, racism, and equity. Okay, I think all of us are at a point where we need a dictionary to translate the left's woke talkback into plain English. Okay, and so to help AMAC readers navigate this brave new world with confidence, we're actually going to bring you occasional updates on what common words now actually mean when they're used by leftists. So the first three entries in the woke dictionary: racist, racism, and equity. These words are everywhere, folks. They're everywhere in our modern political debates, but they don't mean what they used to anymore. They don't, at least not to those on the left. So understanding what these terms mean to the woke is the key to your understanding, and it's the key to their rhetoric and to their ideas. So, this is very important. What does the left woke society mean when they use the word racist? Well, Ibram X. Kendi, he is an often interviewed professor. He is widely to be considered one of the most scholarly voices behind woke ideas about race, systematic racism, and critical race theory. He even has a best selling 2019 book, How to Be an Anti Racist. And that reveals a great deal about modern leftism. At the beginning of that book, he provides the following definition of racist. Here it is: one who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction or expressing a racist idea. Let me read that definition again. One who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction or expressing a racist idea. At first glance, it might seem that even some conservatives could sign up for most of this definition. But one detail to notice is that one can now be deemed a racist for inaction as well as action. It's not just about how you view others and what you believe in your heart. It's about what you do and what you don't do. A radical redefinition of how Americans have traditionally defined racists. This suggests that one can be racist without having any bigoted thoughts or ideas whatsoever. And sure enough, that's what people like Kendi assert. Anyone who does not actively espouse their radical political agenda can now be termed a racist. Racism, the second word in the woke dictionary. From this definition of racist, Kendi goes on to provide this definition of racism. Racism is a marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produces and normalizes racial inequities. Okay, so Kendi says the definition of racism is the marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produces and normalizes racial inequities. The first thing to notice about this definition is that, just as in the case above, racism is no longer the internal bigotry of an individual, but is itself connected to certain policies, which Kendi claims are behind what he calls racial inequities. Now, we're going to get to the concept of inequity in a moment because it is the central concept of the entire anti-racist movement. Kendi himself sheds a great deal of light on what he means by racism in this remarkable statement. He said, "The most threatening racist movement is not the alt-right's unlikely drive for a white ethno-state, but rather the regular Americans' drive for a race-neutral one. The construct of race neutrality actually feeds white nationalists' victimhood by positioning the notion that any policy protecting or advancing non-white Americans toward equity is reverse discrimination." In other words, what Kendi was saying is that he believes that being race neutral is itself an example of racism. This shows that the word racism no longer means what it did in the past, because it doesn't just mean the racial bigotry and hostility and discrimination that the overwhelming majority of Americans believe to be truly awful and indeed sinful. But now it's a new definition of racism that is fundamentally linked to a concept Kendi and others call equity. And this is important, folks, to understand what the left means when they use this word equity. And this is very important. What exactly do they mean by the word equity? Woke ideology depends on this all important idea of equity. So it's so important that we understand what they mean by it. Kendi provides the following definition of racial inequity with examples in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. He says, racial inequity is when two or more racial groups are not standing on approximately equal footing. Here's an example of racial inequity. 71% of white families lived in owner-occupied homes in 2014, compared to 45% of Latinx families and 41% of Black families. Racial equity is when two or more racial groups are standing on a relatively equal footing. An example of racial equity would be if there were relatively equitable percentages of all three racial groups living in owner-occupied homes, whether that was in the 40s, the 70s, or better, even 90 percentile rates, right? In other words, equity is not equality understood in the traditional sense, right? So equity is not equality as we might understand it in the traditional sense. Okay, instead, equality, it means really equality of, in addition to equality of opportunity, which is how I understood the traditional sense of equality to mean, right? Equal opportunity. Not anymore. It now means equality of result. And that is what the left is imposing on all Americans, that we have a guaranteed equality of result. And if that doesn't occur and you don't make it happen or get behind the people who want it to happen, you are then labeled a racist. And this is what we're hearing, folks. This is what we see. This is what's being written. This is what we can find in Kendi's book, How Not to Be a Racist. So Kendi claims any result in which racial groups are not relatively equal, statistically speaking, is by nature an example of racist inequity. Okay, his and every anti-racist task is to ensure that all racial groups are perfectly equal in every statistical measure, because anything less is racial inequity. So this idea of equity as the essential equality of result or outcome was confirmed by no other than now, then Senator Kamala Harris, now our vice president. And she said this just days before the 2020 election, when in a video she said this. She said, so there is a big difference between equality and equity, folks. Equality suggests, oh, everyone should get the same amount. The problem with that, Harris went on to say, is not everybody's starting out from the same place. So if we're all getting the same amount, but you started out way back there and someone else started out way over here, we won't have the same result. And so she says, you're still going to be that far back behind. She said it's about giving people the resources and the support they need so that everyone can be on equal footing and then compete on equal footing. I don't see any competition, though, when we're all guaranteed the same equal result. Equitable treatment means we all end up at the same place. And that is what the left wants you to believe. While Vice President Harris pays lip service to equality of opportunity, by the end, she shows us what she really means. We all have to end up at the same place, is what she says. Thus, the true nature of this ideology is revealed, and we see it. So long as they control the levers of power, they will not stop until we all end up at the same place. It's no coincidence that the left's redefinition of such commonly understood words always ends up requiring more power for them. That's what this is also about, folks. More power to them. Indeed, that's the entire point here. Okay, if these ideas sound a lot like communism to you, well, you wouldn't be wrong. The left have all said that there should be equal outcome, that everyone needs to get the same exact place in order for things to be equal. and that we all must begin and start out on equal footing. I think that's impossible in a free society. We just simply don't start out on the same footing, and we don't, and we never all will. And I think of it this way also. There are no apprenticeships and mentor programs to ensure that Asian American quarterbacks are playing in our NFL or Latino wide receivers are playing. This is an NFL that is nearly 80% African American, although such tools and programs are used to prevent a UC Berkeley student from having too many Asians admitted on merit. Okay, so UC Berkeley will say, no, we've got too many Asians. We can't have more, even though they deserve to be here purely based on merit. We don't see the same applied in the NFL. Just something to think about, right? I think that's something to ponder. The teaching of critical race theory is another way in which the left wants to take away our individuality and shifts more power to those in charge. And so the emotional, the passionate, and the instinctual side of what moves and motivates human beings to get up and actually do something good, I am sensing that the left is trying to take this away. Socialists, Democrats feed off of the racial divide for their own political gain. Achievement is vilified. Excellence is vilified. Curiosity and learning are vilified. And your motivation to do something good is vilified. We should all intend to be free always and to rule ourselves. It is our duty as Americans. Folks, I want to thank you for tuning in today to Amac's podcast, Better for America. That's it for now, and I look forward to having you back with us again next time. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you for listening to the Better for America podcast. To learn more about AMAC and all it has to offer, visit us at www.amac.us.